want to watch it on YouTube afterward. So we have a few events that I want to tell you about. Tomorrow, August 5th at 6 o'clock in Ashkelon Garden in the back is Theater in the Park, The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. The show is 2 hours plus intermission. Bring your own chair, although they do rent out chairs. It's $5 to rent a chair or bring your own blanket. 6 o'clock, not 6:30, not 7, like in previous years. And it is the same theater group as used to do Shakespeare in the Park, Repercussion Theater, so we're delighted to have them back. And then this Sunday, concert to musicians of the World Symphony Orchestra, Jazz and Symphony at 3 p.m. Also here in Ashkelon Garden. Bring your water bottles, it's going to be a warm, beautiful day. And now, without further ado, here is Dr. Jones, Science Demystified.
Hey, I'm glad I heard that announcement. I didn't know about the importance of being earnest here tomorrow night. That is a very good show. Importance of being earnest. It's a classic theater. So I'll go see that for sure. Last time I saw that was in London with John Gielgud. That was pretty good. All right. Let's get going. I kind of entitled this talk today, Things That You Didn't Know, which of course that title would fit almost any talk. But we're going to talk some about some interesting recent developments in food, because we all eat, we're all interested, and there's so much nonsense that goes on about that. But anyway, let me tell you, who do we take nutrition advice from? Should we take it from a guy who, when he welcomes visiting athletes to the White House, which he does, when a team wins the Stanley Cup or, the World Series or some college thing, they come to the White House to meet the president. And there's, refreshments. Well, in this case, the refreshments are appropriate for him because of what he lives on, and it's all the fast food stuff. So is this the kind of guy that we take nutritional advice from? The guy who in the Oval Office on his desk has a button. That button is specific for Diet Coke. Whenever he wants a Diet Coke, he pushes on that button and the butler appears and brings it in. And he drinks a dozen of these a day. So that's his diet. It's fast food and Diet Cokes. And yet he seems to be pretty vigorous. Most people who would live on that diet would have all kinds of consequences. But he seems to be still processing around. His body seems to be functioning. Of course, it's brain dead, but it's body functions. Well, anyway, the recent gem that he came out with last week was that Coca-Cola should be switching to sugar as the sweetener instead of high fructose corn syrup, which we usually referred to as HFCS, so that's how we'll be talking about it. And there lies an interesting story. I mean, he thinks that this is going to make America healthy again, which of course is just a stupid premise in the first place, because there is no time in history where America was healthier than what it is now. I mean, what is he thinking of when they were mired in tuberculosis and polio and all kinds of infectious diseases. Anyway, he is on record, and he was all over the news last week, telling Coca-Cola to switch from high fructose corn syrup to sugar, because this was going to have an impact on health. Now, of course, he really has no idea of what high fructose corn syrup is. So I don't know where he's even getting his information. It's probably from the imbecile Kennedy, he also has no knowledge of anything. All right, but anyway, let's explore this a little bit because it is an interesting issue. Well, first of all, sugar. What is it? Where does it come from? There are two main sources of sugar. It comes either from sugar cane or from sugar beet. We don't grow any sugar cane in Canada. It's a tropical climate is needed for that. We do grow some sugar beets, but not very much. Anyway, it isn't that hard to get the sugar out of there. It basically means chopping up these things and boiling it up in hot water, which is off the sugar, and you can just crystallize it from there. So it's not a very difficult process. Now, there's also a question of terminology here, of what sugar really means. To most people, sugar means what comes in your sugar bowl, right? Which you sprinkle on your food. Chemically speaking, that's not what sugar is. Sugar is a whole family of molecules that are sweet and belong into the chemical family of carbohydrates. So, although in common language, we use the term sugar for mostly for cane sugar, but chemically, I want to explain a little bit to you of what we really mean. This sugar that we get from sugar cane, or we get from sugar beets. Oh, I just noticed a spelling mistake there. That, of course, should be sugar. The sugar that we talk about is sucrose. Sucrose is also referred to as a disaccharide because it is made from two smaller molecules, which are glucose and fructose, that are chemically joined together. So that's what sucrose is. Now, what about high fructose corn syrup? Well, of course, just the nomenclature here, high fructose corn syrup, implies that this is mostly fructose. We'll get back to that because that isn't exactly correct. But what is this high fructose corn syrup? Well, as the name implies, it does start out from corn. And from corn, you can isolate cornstarch. And most of you probably have that in your kitchen. And it's usually the thickener. If you want to thicken gravies, for example, you use cornstarch. Well, cornstarch is a polymer or a giant molecule, which is composed of smaller units of glucose. And these units of glucose are joined together in a long chain, as you can diagrammatically see it over here. So in order to make high fructose corn syrup, what one has to do is start with cornstarch and break it down into individual glucose units. And this is done by molecules we call enzymes. Enzymes are special proteins that act as catalysts. They can encourage reactions to go more quickly. A catalyst never causes the reaction to go that would not go in absence of a catalyst. The only thing it can do is speed up a reaction. So if you would actually leave cornstarch out in a moist environment for a couple 100 years, you can try that experiment. It would eventually break down into just glucose. So what these catalysts can do is speed up that reaction. So the first step is to take cornstarch and break it down into glucose, and this is done with the use of enzymes. Now, what we're really talking about here is biotechnology, the use of living systems to carry out reactions. So all of these enzymes can be isolated either from fungi or from bacteria, and they are put to work. That's what biotechnology is, putting a living system to work. So these enzymes will break down the starch molecule into individual glucose units. And then comes the final step in making of high fructose corn syrup, and that is to convert some of the glucose into fructose. Now, glucose and fructose are what we call isomers, which means that they have exactly the same molecular composition. As you can see, both of those are C6H12O6, but the atoms are joined together in a different fashion. That's what isomers are. Why would you want to convert some of the glucose into fructose? Because fructose is much sweeter than glucose. You can control the extent of this reaction, that is, what percent of the glucose you want to turn into fructose. That's how you determine what the final sweetness is going to be. So to recap here, high fructose corn syrup starts with corn. The corn is broken down into glucose, first into cornstarch, and then into glucose. Some of the glucose is converted into fructose, and that's how you get the high fructose corn syrup. Why do you want to do this? Why would you want to go through all of this when you have sugar in the first place? What's the usual answer to that? Money, right? High fructose corn syrup is cheap. And the reason that it is cheap is because not only is corn easy to grow, but in the US, it is highly subsidized. Corn growers are given money by the government to grow corn. This is a farm subsidy. So corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, can be produced much more cheaply than sugar, which of course is the motivation for using it. And the amount of glucose that is converted into fructose can be controlled just by how long you allow that reaction to proceed. If you allow it to proceed for a long time, then most of the glucose will get converted into fructose. But it turns out that in terms of texture, the ideal for putting into beverages is one that is 55% fructose and 45% glucose. So when you see on the label of your soft drink high fructose corn syrup, what you're talking about is 55% fructose and 45% glucose. In comparison to cane sugar, which I showed you is a disaccharide made of glucose and fructose, so once that breaks apart, you get a 50-50 mixture. So the question here is, does that have any kind of an impact on your health? That small difference in glucose and fructose? Well, the answer isn't quite that it has zero impact, but it has minimal impact. If they are virtually identical, that is sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. Why do I say virtually? Because fructose is actually handled differently in the body. It's metabolized differently. As you may know, glucose is the main source of energy for the body. In order for it to enter cells so it can be used as energy, you need insulin. So insulin is needed for the body's use of glucose. Insulin is not needed for the body's use of fructose. What happens is that instead fructose in the liver is metabolized and it can be a source of energy. But some of the fructose that is not needed for energy is stored in the liver as glycogen. Glycogen is a storage molecule that can release energy whenever it is needed, when there's not enough glucose coming into the system. So fructose can serve as a source of energy. However, if there is a lot of fructose in the body, it will also be converted to fat. And this is where this whole controversy comes in. This is why high fructose corn syrup is said by some people to be the cause of obesity in North America because of the conversion to fat. This is just not the case, because that conversion only happens when there's no glucose coming into the body, which almost never happens. Nobody has a diet where they have fructose but no glucose. It just doesn't happen. So there really is no difference. And in terms of calories, whether you're talking about high fructose corn syrup or sugar, it's 4 calories per gram. So it is absurd to say that obesity in North America is due to high fructose corn syrup. It isn't. And I gave you the metabolic arguments for here. So it's just absolute nonsense. The obesity is due to poor diet and less mobility. That's what we see in North America. That is what is the cause of obesity. It is the food. But whether it is sugar or corn syrup is irrelevant because it will give you the same number of calories. And that difference in metabolism that I just described would only be relevant if there's no glucose coming into the body at all, which of course is never the case because we all eat carbohydrates, we all eat starchy foods, we all consume some sugar. So there's always some glucose. So this idea that just by going from high fructose corn syrup to cane sugar in Coca-Cola is absolute scientific nonsense, that this would have any kind of effect on health. The only thing that people like that, or anyone who has any kind of digital authority, the only thing that they should be suggesting is to drink less of anything that contains either high fructose corn syrup or sugar. That's the only advice that they should be given. Now, why is Trump trying to strong-arm Coca-Cola into switching to sugar? Well, I think there's a simple answer for that. And that is that he is now trying to distract in any way that he can from the whole Epstein business. So that's why this emerged last week. That's why all the other silliness that is coming from him has emerged, because he just wants to distract the press from all of that. Well, there are other things too, of course, that we've been hearing about how to make America healthier again. And one that has been widely talked about in last little while is this elimination of so-called coal tar dyes and replace them by natural dyes. Well, therein lies an interesting story, but again, this is not going to make America healthier. But nevertheless, it is scientifically interesting. Now, the so-called synthetic dyes have a long history and indeed a lot of controversy. The first red dye that created this controversy was red dye number 2, which in the 1960s was first studied by the Russians, who found that it caused cancer in Russian rats. And the Americans then, of course, wondered, well, what the hell do the Russians know about red? But when some American studies also corroborated this in mice, that high dose of red dye number 2 were in fact carcinogenic, it was removed from the market. And we haven't worried about that since 1976, even though that dye was used for some 70 years prior to that, without anyone ever noticing any kind of problem in humans. And then just last year, you remember the Food and Drug Administration banned red dye number 3 from all kinds of foods, particularly beverages. So of course they had to find replacement for that. And one of the replacements was cochineal red, which I've described to you before, tiny little insects that are raised on cacti, mostly in Mexico and the Canary Islands. The female produces a red dye that can be extracted and it can be used in foods. It can also be made synthetically, and there are all kinds of foods today that are colored with cochineal extract. But it is not the only red dye that is now in use. Another one is red dye number 40. And this is also becoming controversial. I mean, all the synthetic dyes now are being examined. And I mean, red dye number 40 is used in a large number of foods. For example, this sucker, which lollipop, which is interesting because it has a cricket inside, and just this excites little kids. It excites adults less. But anyway, this is something that is dyed, as you can see, with red dye number 40. This artificial flavoring, it has high in sugar. I mean, obviously, we won't realize that this kind of thing is not a health food. But red dye number 40 is also used in a large number of other foods. But before any dye is put on the market, it does have to be studied. And the general way of studying this is either by using laboratory animals like mice or seeing what happens in cell cultures. Because, of course, you cannot do ethical studies on humans. You cannot start giving a human red dye in increasing doses to see, what eventually happens. So, of course, we rely on these laboratory experiments. And I can tell you that if you subject mice or cells in culture to anything in increasing doses, something will happen. And then you can write a paper about it, like this one here. Synthetic fruit dye, red dye number 40, causes DNA damage, causes colonic inflammation, impacts microbiome in mice. That's what it does in mice, true. But it does that in doses that are not comparable to what we would ingest. These are much, much higher doses. And in order to approximate what would be an acceptable daily intake for people, what is normally done is you start giving animals doses until you see some effect. You divide that by 100, a factor of 100 for human safety, and that's what becomes the acceptable daily intake for humans. That's why we don't pay all that much attention to these studies which use grotesque amounts of substances on animals. So, yes, they've investigated red dye number 40, which also is called Allura red. Good name, right? Because it's alluring. And indeed, you can find that in certain cases where you give these test animals very, very large doses, you can cause inflammation, you can cause changes in their microbiome, and you can also trigger cancer. But there is absolutely no evidence that any of this has ever happened in people. On the other hand, I think that food dyes are only cosmetic. We don't need them. They generally attract people to foods that are poor nutritional quality. So, I'm not a pro-food dye guy, but the fact is that there's no scientific study that shows that they are really harmful. So why is it that in Europe, they actually have a warning label, may have an adverse effect on activity and attention in children? And this is because of a study called the Southampton study, because it was done at Southampton University, that looked at two groups of children, 3-year-olds and 8-9-year-olds, who were given a number of different dyes and a number of other chemicals, including some preservatives, and in increasing doses, and their behavior was subjectively studied, which means that their teachers and their parents were asked to evaluate their behavior, supposedly without the teacher or the parents knowing which kids were being given these particular dyes. And at least according to the study, they suggested that there may be an increase in hyperactivity in children that is triggered by some of these food dyes, but only in children who are hyperactive to start with. Anyway, this is, it's pretty controversial whether that's true or not, because, children become hyperactive in, cases like birthday parties where they're given ice cream and cake and all of that, which may have nothing to do with the dyes that are in those foods. That's to do just with the atmosphere. Anyway, in Europe, they are overly cautious. And because of the extent to which these red dyes are found in foods, they say, let's be on the safe side and give people this warning. So at least they know that if they want to ensure that hyperactive kids don't become more hyperactive, you keep them away from these dyes. But just to give you an idea of the dosages, what they used in that Southampton study, which is the one that is quoted all over the place when they discuss these things, what they were using as a reference was the amount of food dye that is available in 2 packs of candies, 256-gram packs of candies eaten every day. Now, who does that? I mean, no kid even does that. And where else do you find red dye number 40? You find it at things like Twizzlers. Okay. Well, we can do without those. We can even do, I think, without lobster gummy candy. It's not essential to our life, right? So this is really my issue with these food dyes. It's not that they are inherently unsafe. I don't think that that's true. The evidence just isn't there. But what is certainly true is that you don't find them in an apple or an orange and a banana. You find them in foods that generally are not good in terms of nutrition. And they will attract kids to them. But just changing a synthetic dye to a natural dye does not make that food inherently healthier. In Europe, they are changing some of these things. So M&Ms in Europe don't have the same composition in terms of dyes as we have in Canada and in the US. In Canada and the US, we use all of these synthetic dyes. In Europe, as you can see, they get their orange color from carotene, then red from beetroot, curcumin, this is in turmeric, it gives you yellow, spirulina extract, green. And so there certainly are natural versions. They're not quite as bright. They're not bad, not quite as bright. In North America, M&M's has resisted making this change. Why? Because they think that kids are more attracted to the brighter color. And it's all about selling stuff. So I have no objection at all to changing from the synthetic dyes to that. I think it's irrelevant. But to suggest that that is healthier than this because of the difference in dyes is lunacy, right? It has nothing to do with it. This is an unhealthy food. And you consume it sometimes because, I mean, we all want, little dose of luxury in some way in life sometime. But it's just nonsense to suggest that by switching, one type of diet to another, you're making this into a healthier food. And, unfortunately, these days, whenever you follow nutritional science, you get all this, eat that, don't eat this, don't eat that. And the term that has been used for this, I like that term. It is nutritional whiplash, right? Because you don't know whom to listen to. One day, something is good, the next day is not. Well, of course, in real science, we go by evidence. And that comes from the peer-reviewed literature, scientific journals, where experts will review a paper before it is published. Of course, as I've told you many times, it's not foolproof because people are not foolproof. If someone is willing to lie and cheat, like Andrew Wakefield did when he wrote that horrific paper suggesting that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine is linked to autism, if someone is going to be fraudulent, well, it doesn't get caught immediately because the reviewers, of course, cannot redo a study. They have to assume that the work was submitted is correct. So while we listen to this, we listen to the peer-reviewed evidence, the general public does not. This basically is where most people, believe it or not, get their information. Because the social media, popular magazines, popular books get all of the attention. And, people like the Liver King, who claims that just by eating liver, you're going to live forever. Or Joe Mercola, who's the most fiendish promoter of disinformation on the internet. Brian Johnson, who takes 250 dietary supplements a day. Gwyneth Paltrow, actress. Kim Kardashian, not even an actress. Then the food babe, Dave Asprey, who believes that butter is the cure-all for everything. Jordan Peterson, the former U of T psychology professor, who's become a promoter of the carnivore diet. This is what people listen to, like Dave Asprey. And it's very popular, social media, tells people to put butter into their coffee. And this is what has become bulletproof coffee. The idea that it makes the person bulletproof in terms of any kind of disease. So he tells us that. And then we go to the American Heart Institute, who tell us, well, to stay away from butter, because butter is full of saturated fats, which are not good for you. And then, of course, we hear about what to eat if you're not eating butter, what fats are good. And we've been told that vegetable fats are much better than animal fats, which basically is correct. On the other hand, just within the last month or so, we've had all of this information about how the seed oils are really dangerous to our health, and that we should be staying away from soybean or corn oil, etc. Who tells us these things? Well, scientific giants like Kennedy, who really is very irritating because he is wrong about everything he says, just about everything. I say just about because I think he does correctly say that we are eating too many ultra-processed foods. That's true. But just because he once in a while gets something right doesn't mean that he forgive all of its other indiscretions. So, we're being sort of thrown back and forth on the waves of nutritional information. Sugar, we're told, is pure poison, which of course is an overstatement. Yes, we should limit our sugar intake, but it doesn't kill us. It's not arsenic, And then, of course, we're urged to use artificial sweeteners instead until a study comes out that they show that they are the link to diabetes. So this is this kind of nutritional whiplash that I was talking about. Well, as I said, I like that term. When I came across it, it was introduced in this article, which came from the National Chicken Association. And yes, there is such a thing. And as you can see here, they talk about nutritional whiplash because of a study that came out. Now, we've always assumed that chicken is pretty good to eat, right? And then we have this study. Does poultry consumption increase the risk of mortality for gastrointestinal cancer? A preliminary competing risk analysis. Well, what the hell? If it's preliminary, why are you publishing it? Okay, wait until you have proper evidence. But these days, we're still living in this publish or perish situation in academia, and people just push the envelope and try to publish anything that seems reasonable. Anyway, this study implied that eating chicken is not so safe, which resulted in all kinds of articles like this. Killer chicken. Eating 300 grams of chicken a week can give you cancer. New study finds eating just 300 grams of chicken a week associated with 27% increase in risk of dying. That always bugs me when you get things like that. A percentage increases the risk of dying. The risk of dying is 100%, right? I mean, except for one controversial case 2,000 years ago, we know that everyone dies. So the only way that you can talk about changes in mortality is if you're talking about a given time frame that you can do. If you want to study someone and you want to study them between 1980 and 2020 and study a population, you can count how many people died, and then you can determine the risk of mortality. But anyway, the study obviously was great clickbait because everyone capitalized on that, and you saw all of these articles about 300 grams of chicken being dangerous. Let's dig into this a little bit. First of all, how much is 300 grams of chicken? It's about that. It's two small breasts. It's not a lot. Okay. So what this study did was come to a conclusion that you increase your risk of dying by 20%, 7%. Okay. Well, so the risk of dying is 100%. But what they did was to study over a specific time frame, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But I mean, this study was really upsetting to a lot of people because we've always heard that you want to replace red meat with chicken, right? That it's healthier. So what the hell is going on here? So here's what this study actually did. It was done in Italy. And they followed the diet and the health status of, as you can see, close to 5,000 middle-aged Italians for 19 years. Okay? So when we talk about changes in mortality or changes in a disease, we're talking about in that 19-year period. So if there indeed were fewer people who died in that period, then you can talk about a decrease in mortality to some reason. Now, mortality is not difficult to determine. You know whether someone is dead or alive, right? So we can count the number of people who have died over that period, over that 19-year period. But how do you know what they have eaten over that 19-year period? You know that because they were subjected to questionnaires filled out periodically. And this is what these questionnaires look like. They're actually very elaborate. Where you tick off boxes about how many times you've eaten something during, the last week or last month, depending on the questionnaire. It's very difficult to fill these things out. And if you ever try to do that, you'll see, how complicated this is. Now, there are some flaws, obviously, with this. First of all, you are sort of assuming that people will keep eating the way that they were eating when they filled out that form. These surveys are not done every day. They're not done every week. They're not even done every month. In many cases, they're done once, and then people are followed for a period of time with the assumption that that's how they always eat. Or sometimes they will fill out a form every 3 or 4 years. It doesn't mean that that's how they eat all the time. And of course, there is a real problem, which we talked about before, that people are not adept at reporting exactly what they ate, especially when it comes to weights, right? Before I showed you what 300 grams of chicken looks like, I would think that if I did a survey here and asked you, what does 300 grams of chicken look like? We'd get a whole range of answers. Right? And yet all of these questionnaires are based on people being able to describe in terms of weight exactly what they have done. Now, the other real problem with such studies is that the only thing that they can find is a correlation. That is, you can find, for example, that people who have eaten more than 300 grams of chicken have a greater risk of some disease. But it doesn't mean that this is cause and effect, because there could be many, many other variables. And one of the most important things to understand is that an association or correlation can never show a cause and effect. And the classic example, of course, is in the summer, sales of ice cream go up, the incidence of sunburn goes up. But ice cream does not cause sunburn, right? And yet the association is very strong. The association between breast cancer and wearing skirts is very strong, but skirts do not cause the disease. So you have to be very careful in terms of interpreting studies. All right, well, so let's interpret. Let's look, for example, at this 27% decrease in mortality. So relative to eating less than 100 grams of chicken, the risk is 1.27. So that's where your 27% increase in mortality comes from. So what they found was that in these 5,000 people over the 19 years, people who ate more than 300 grams of chicken, relative to those who ate less than 100 grams, there was an increase in mortality. That is, they were more likely to die during that 19-year period, and the increase was 27%. Okay, that's an interesting statistic. Now, you can also take a look at the red meat consumption, which they also studied. And if you look at that, what do you see? The risk of dying actually decreased. There was a 3% decrease in mortality in red meat. This flies in the face of everything that we know about nutrition. So of course, it already, calls into question the data from this study. But there are other questions. For example, in this study, poultry consumption was at greater risk than red meat consumption. And you can see they compare the 105 to the 227, poultry consumption, greater risk. Again, that really doesn't make sense in terms of everything else that we know about nutrition. And then there's this unusual finding. Poultry consumption in men and in women. The risk, whatever there is greater in men than in women. And yet, when you look at red meat consumption, the risk is greater in women than in men. There's no physiological explanation for this, for such a gender difference. We just don't see that in any area of nutrition. So, all of these things really call into question this study. There are many, many holes in this study, more than one can count. Aside from the question that I've raised about the numbers, there are other things. For example, there was no differentiation between chicken or processed chicken. Well, that's a huge difference nutritionally. The processed chicken products have a lot of salt. They have a lot of nitrites. They have more fat than a chicken breast would have. They didn't distinguish between chicken, turkey, or duck. Duck is much fattier than chicken. They didn't take into account the cooking methods, right? Whether you boil it or you fry it or you charcoal barbecue it makes a difference. Then, of course, there's also the question of, other foods. Our diet is composed of dozens and dozens of different foods. So maybe the people who were eating more than 300 grams of chicken were doing something else too. They were eating other stuff that was not conducive to health. And also they did not monitor for activity levels, which of course is a critical determinant of health. And we know that other organizations like the World Cancer Research Fund, American Institute of Cancer, all recommend eating poultry over red meat for good reason. Chicken, especially chicken breast, is a very high protein food. And many seniors don't get enough protein. So a serving of chicken will give you 26 grams of protein. You need about 90 grams a day. And it's also relatively low in calories, and it doesn't have sodium. Only the processed chicken products have sodium. So I think this 300 grams of chicken a week is nonsense. I would not worry about eating 3 chicken breasts a week. It's perfectly fine. And then there's another question that comes up is how do you prepare this, right? Because that makes a difference, as I just mentioned. And the fact is that if you stew the chicken rather than fry it or broil it, it makes a big difference in its chemical composition. When you heat it to a high temperature, either in the oven or in the barbecue, you produce a number of carcinogens. The heterocyclic amines and the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, these all form when you subject the meat to a high temperature. And then there's also the question of should you be cooking breast or legs? That makes a difference. There's a huge fat difference between the chicken leg and the chicken breast. Also, it depends on what you're making. If you're going to make chicken paprikash, you do not want to do that with the breast because it'll give you no flavor. You want to do it on the legs, right? On the other hand, if you're going to grill a chicken, the breast does very well. So here's some more whiplash. Should it be chicken breast or should it be chicken legs? So these questions, come up all the time. And they come up because we're constantly in search of well-being, right? This is what we want. I mean, we want all to be healthy. We want to push off death to the very last moment. And the advertisers, of course, will cater to this. So, for example, when you ask the question, who wouldn't want to improve their mood, have more energy, enhance concentration, more efficient workout, and feeling of well-being? Everyone wants that. Yeah, no one's going to say, no, I don't want that. Well, what is going to give you this? This advertising actually comes from this product, which you can buy in health food stores or you can buy it online. Well, what is Area gerensis? It is an extract of an orchid. There it is. It's a very pretty orchid. And of course, like all plants, it contains hundreds of different compounds, one of which is N,N-dimethylphenethylamine, very often abbreviated as DMPEA. This is a very interesting component of that orchid because it is chemically similar, and you don't have to have any understanding of chemistry to see that there is a chemical similarity here, to phenethylamine, which is a very important biochemical that occurs in the human body. It is formed in the body from phenylalanine, which is an amino acid. It's part of all proteins. So we have this chemical in our body. And of course, anything that is made in the body is there for a purpose. Evolution has determined that we don't have superfluous substances in our body. So this phenethylamine is a central nervous system stimulant and also a booster of dopamine and serotonin, and both of those are mood enhancers. So indeed, phenylethylamine controls mood, and phenylethylamine also stimulates the release of norepinephrine, which is a hormone. It's part of the fight or flight response. So anyway, this molecule is very important in terms of biochemical functions. Interesting enough, every Valentine's Day, it's also trotted out because it is found in chocolate, and it has been said to be the love chemical, which is, of course, nonsense. But it is found in chocolate. And it does have, as I told you, phenylethylamine has all these beneficial properties. So why don't we just take supplements of phenylethylamine, which the supplement manufacturers are very happy to sell you. You can find them in the health food store. The problem is that you cannot take this orally because it is broken down in the body by an enzyme, and that enzyme is called monoamine oxidase. So it is useless to take this either in chocolate or in a supplement. Your body will break it down. So there has been the question, could we make a molecule similar to this in the laboratory? Could we, chemically synthesize something that is similar, but that doesn't get broken down? Now, it's a good possibility. This has been done. And the classic examples are amphetamine and methamphetamine, which, as you can see, are chemically similar to phenethylamine. Well, one of the compounds that has been found to be similar to phenethylamine is this one that we talked about, that is found in the orchid. So this is what has unleashed all of this marketing. However, the fact is that no one has ever shown that this molecule, DMPA, has a stimulant effect like phenylethylamine. I mean, just because it happens to resemble it chemically doesn't mean it's going to act exactly like that. Just like amphetamine doesn't act exactly like phenylethylamine. In fact, it has some negative consequences. So it just hasn't been studied. We don't know. And suggesting that it's a fat burner, which they do, is absolute nonsense. There is no evidence for that whatsoever. So what evidence do we have? We have some anecdotal accounts from people who say that when they take this stuff, after working out, they feel more energetic. This counts for nothing in science. We have to have the proper studies. Now, it is possible that taking an extract of aerogenesis has some sort of benefit. But before you jump on that bandwagon, you have to demonstrate that in proper studies. Well, interesting enough, question comes up, where does this stand legally? How is it that they're allowed to sell this stuff? Well, it's just sort of interesting because it actually does have a flavor and it is allowed as a flavoring ingredient. So it can be added to foods as a flavoring agent. But there it is added in very tiny amounts. As far as boosting energy, whatever, the World Anti-Doping Agency lists all phenylethylamine derivatives, including amphetamine and methamphetamine and this stuff, as not allowed to be used. So it is sort of a legalistic limbo here, because what you get in these supplements are huge amounts of that chemical, not what you find as the flavoring in food. So really, this is a question of buyer beware. And this has been underlined just a couple of weeks ago by this study that came out that looked specifically at these supplements, which are supposedly extracts of the orchid. But the fact is that that molecule can also be made synthetically in the lab, which is what's in the supplements, not that that matters. Molecule structure is what determines what it is. Anyway, here's what they found. This is worth looking at. None of the 12 aerogenesis supplements analyzed were accurately labeled. The products contained inaccurately labeled quantities of caffeine, theobromine, hormonine, yohimbine, dimethylphenethylamine, and synephrine. Products that listed caffeine on the label contained quantities ranging from 0.1 to 665 milligrams. 9 of 12 products either listed an ingredient on the label that was not detected in the product or contained the stimulant not listed on the label. 4 of the 12 products contained undeclared stimulants. In addition, 2 of these products contain a compound, 1,4-dimethylamine, that is illegal. So this doesn't give you much confidence, right? And this is the problem that we've talked about often with supplements. You don't know what is in there because these are not regulated like drugs. It's a wild, wild west there. All right, one final story I want to tell you. You know that I'm a fan of Sherlock Holmes, especially because of his classic quote that it's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories and of theories to suit facts. Okay, why do I bring this up? There's a quote in one of the classic Sherlock Holmes stories, comes from Silver Blaze. Silver Blaze is the name of a horse, and the story is all about this racehorse that is stolen. And there's, in this story, there's a classic quote. a conversation between Sherlock Holmes and a Scotland Yard detective who has also been called in because this horse has been stolen. Is there any point to which you'd like to draw my attention? This point, Sherlock Holmes says, to the curious incidents of the dog in the nighttime. But the dog did nothing in the nighttime, says the policeman. That was the curious incident. Why was it curious? Well, Holmes investigates and finds out that the stolen horse was in a barn where a dog also slept. And it would have been unbelievable that some thief, some strange thief, comes in and takes the horse without the dog barking. So Holmes concludes that the only answer to that is that the dog knew who the thief was, which actually turns out to be the case. So that's the story of the dog that did not bark in the nighttime. But I was reminded of this because of a letter to the editor in a scientific journal that was labeled The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Bathtub. Well, obviously playing on the idea of the Sherlock Holmes story. And this was actually subsequent to another study that was published by the same authors, Musical Instruments, Fungal Spores, and Hypersensitivity Pneumonitis. This is very interesting. Now, pneumonitis is not pneumonia. It is a discomfort in the lungs, usually because of the inhalation of small, some sort of small particulate matter. It is decidedly unpleasant because it comes with breathlessness and non-productive cough. So a gentleman showed up at the doctor's office complaining of these symptoms. And the doctors questioned him about the lifestyle, etc. And it turned out that he was a musician and he played the French horn. Now, this was interesting to the doctor because it is well known that these instruments, which are the wind instruments, of course, can be contaminated with saliva on the inside. And saliva is a nutrient for bacteria and for fungi. So what they did was they took the horn and they analyzed it. They took it apart, piece by piece, and they subjected each piece to analysis. And what they discovered was that indeed there was contamination by a fungus, and the spores of that fungus were inhaled, and this they thought could cause the problem. They prescribed methylprednisolone, which is a classic anti-inflammatory, and the guy felt better and went home. You know, they didn't hear from him for another 6 months. When he came back with the same kind of symptoms, this pneumonitis, and they once again tested the French horn, and once again they found that it was contaminated by fungi. That is, the original cleaning that had been recommended after the first episode apparently wasn't effective. So he was told that he had to go, and if he wanted to continue his music, to buy a new instrument, which he did. These are not cheap instruments, as you probably know, thousands of dollars. But he was back again after having used the new instrument, which once again they cultured and they found exactly the same fungus growing in it. Supposedly it had been properly cleaned, and so the doctor started questioning him. How exactly do you clean your French horn? And he said, well, the way that it is mostly suggested, and that is by washing it regularly in the bathtub, taking it apart and drying it and putting it all together. Now, the doctor really became suspicious because this particular fungus is known to be found in water. So he made a house call to actually check what was going on. And he questioned them about where, the water came from, and there seemed to be no problem with that. It was regular, treated tap water. And then during the questioning, something else emerged interesting, is that every Sunday after the morning walk of the dog, they would bathe him in the bathtub. Well, this was the clue, because it turns out that this particular fungus is found in soil. So, of course, the dog was out there walking without shoes. So right away, attention focused on his paws. And sure enough, when they cultured that, they found the fungus. So the dog was being washed in the water was contaminated, that's what contaminated the French horn. So of course, the musician was told to find another way of cleaning it, and there are solutions that are designed exactly for that. So that solved the problem, and he's happily tooting his own horn these days. And the interestingly enough, the finale to this little story is the final little comment in the paper by the scientists. This is a satisfying conclusion to an unusual case of tenor horn lung, where a fastidious spinning regime was, unbeknownst to the patient, perpetuating colonization of the tenor horn, suggesting that this fungus is not a naturally occurring member of the musical microbiome. Interesting term there, the musical microbiome. So in this case, this really was the curious incident of the dog in the bathtub. So now hopefully you know some things that you didn't know before, but I will give you one more thing to know. This is an early announcement that this year our Troche Science Symposium will take place on October 21st. That's a Tuesday night. And our speaker is Dr. Drew Weissman, who was the co-inventor of the COVID-19 vaccine, for which he got the Nobel Prize. And he's going to tell the very interesting story of how that vaccine really came about, the accidental discoveries that were involved, and all the politicking and all the finances that were involved. So I think you'll find that interesting. We're going to note down that date, 7 p.m. on October 21st. It should be a very interesting discussion, because as you know, there has been controversy, ridiculous controversy over the vaccine, but how it came to be and sort of the circuitous route that led to the Nobel Prize. That makes a very interesting story. All right, that's it for today. Unless you have any questions? Yeah. Yes. Again, this is a whole world. They're promoting this. And of course, it depends on which mushroom. I mean, there's umpteen, types of mushroom. Some of them certainly do have medicinal properties. But once again, you don't know exactly what you're dealing with. You don't know what the dosage is. And some mushrooms are possibly beneficial. Some are highly toxic. I mean, some mushrooms are so deadly that one bite can kill you. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure that they make sure that those are not the ones in the mushroom coffee. But I think it's too early, And again, you want to have studies on these things. Yeah. For sure, obesity is a question of the two-pronged behavior, what you put into your mouth and what you do with your body in terms of activity. I mean, 60, 70 years ago, people were much more active than they are today. That's for sure. Yeah. And, also prior to the whole supermarket era, I mean, people cooked at home. And when you cook at home, you don't put as much salt and much sugar into your food. And now when you look into the supermarket, you know, when you walk around the middle of the supermarket and all the boxed stuff, and look at the labels, you see the high calorie content. I mean, our whole way of eating has changed and our activity levels have changed. So it's not a surprise that, you know, we see epidemic of obesity. Now, a very big component of that are the sugary soft drinks. These are really the scourge of our society. I mean, kids are drinking copious amounts of you know, all the soft drinks. We need to do something about that. I mean, whether it's taxation or yeah. Pardon? The reason that we live longer is mostly because of better medical care. And, you know, the conditions that were killing us before, infectious diseases, now are controlled, you know, and cholesterol levels are controlled, blood pressure is controlled. Certainly, we're not living longer because we're eating better. I can tell you that. We're not eating better. Yeah. Ingesting collagen, possibly. Collagen is a protein. It's found in all connective tissues in the body. And it's a very important body component, but it's a protein. And as any protein, when you consume it, it's broken down to amino acids. So the question is whether or not those amino acids will reconstitute themselves into proteins that the body needs. And this is it's an interesting argument. But the fact is that the reason that we lose collagen as we get older from our connective tissues is not because our body doesn't have enough of the raw material to make it. We eat enough protein, we get enough amino acids. It's just that the body, as we age, becomes less adept at rejoining those amino acids into collagen. So therefore, eating collagen, in theory, doesn't make much sense. On the other hand, it's possible that some people do not get enough protein in their diet, and collagen is a protein, so serve that purpose. But then, of course, there's a lot of hype about collagen cosmetically, that it, you know, it can tighten your skin and all of that. Only when a dermatologist or plastic surgeon injects it, then, but not by eating it. Yeah. 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 It could be. I mean, just yes, but how do you make wine? You take the grapes which have the sugar in it, and you add the yeast that converts the sugar into alcohol. So if you convert all of the sugar into alcohol, you indeed have a low sugar or no sugar wine. Yeah, but in any case, let me put it this way. If your concern is about sugar in wine, you're drinking too much wine. Okay, first, before you go any further, as soon as you start sentence, like most people say, I can say that that is likely to be wrong, because most people are wrong. Okay. Yes, I prefer to use butter over margarine as well. Yeah, the original problem with margarine was it contained what we call trans fats. Margarine no longer contain that, so that the nutritional difference really is not much between butter and margarine. But there's no question that butter tastes better. Okay, so once again, I would say the same thing I said about wine. That if your concern is whether butter or margarine is better, then you're eating too much of either one. When you eat a moderate amount, it doesn't matter. So I prefer butter. It is, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the first problem with avocado oil, which is actually very good oil, is it's hyper expensive, right? So I mean, that's the big. But in terms of nutritional difference, minimal difference between avocado oil or canola oil. I like canola oil. I think it's, plus of course you're supporting Canada. Canola comes from Canadian oil. So we don't want any of those American seed oils. We don't want anything American, right? Okay, we'll see you next week. Next month.